I think we have enough people that we can kind of start. And then anybody who joins, hopefully they'll be able to catch on. So good afternoon and welcome to part one of our fee negotiation series, Architects and Clients, which is co-hosted by the IES and Alexandra Christiana, who is here today. We hope that there will be a lot of participation from everyone, and we are happy to have our speakers here today, Bobby Williams, who is the Assistant Principal with HMSH Architects, and Brian Fontaine, Project Architect and Project Manager with Turver Design Solutions. We also have part two of the series, which is Architects and Consultants, and that will be on February 29th. So stay tuned for more information. And now I will turn things over to Alexandra so she can cover the required AIA announcement. So thanks again, everybody, for joining.
So we will be offering one AIA learning unit or certificate of attendance for anyone to self-report to whichever organization they need. We have 4 learning units today. At the end of this session, you should be able to explain to an external design team the scope of a project and the timeline that will be required to understand how this will impact the project fee. You should be able to prepare documents to share with the client regarding fees for a specific project. You should be able to describe to a client the elements that support the fee being requested. You should be able to track the budget through the life of the project, keeping in mind the negotiated fee. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to pass it over to Rosalind to start off the conversation.
Sure, thanks. So excuse my voice, kind of getting over a cold, but I think it's better than it has been, so bear with me a little bit. And I'll just say, if anyone has any questions or anything they want to add to the conversation, please feel free to unmute and chime in at any time, or if you'd rather put it in the chat, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat and find a good time to bring it up in the conversation. But like Tracy said, we want this to be kind of interactive, so everyone feel welcome. So to kind of kick us off, I think Bobby, you're going to go first, and we're going to ask you to talk a little bit about the type of work that you do and the process that you go through for determining appropriate fees for your work.
Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody. And if anybody has questions as I'm going through, I do encourage you just to chime in, because I can't see any hands raised. So if you raise your hands, I won't be able to call on you, and someone else might be able to. But please chime in, and I would prefer it to be a conversation. I don't have any formal slides or anything to go over, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the public sector, because HMFH Architects, we do primarily K through 12, a little bit of higher ed, but where it's mostly K through 12 public schools. As most of you, or some of you might know, that the Massachusetts School Building Authority has a steady pipeline of schools that come out. So there's kind of 2 sides. There's MSBA work and there's non-MSBA work. And each of the fees are, you know, when you're building them up, you think about them similarly, but there's some nuances that we might talk a little bit about today. But starting with the MSBA has a very prescriptive process, and they have set contracts that really identify what's in basic services and what's not in basic services. And when you put together a fee, knowing what's in your basic services is definitely key, because you want to ensure that when you write that fee letter, you're letting clients know ahead of time what scope of work you're willing to do as part of your basic service and what scope of work you're not. That can get you in a lot of trouble if you don't clearly define that in your scoping letters to the clients. So that's something we spend a lot of time trying to understand. When you have a non-MSBA client, a lot of times it's listed in the RFP or RFQ what you're to include in basic services. And just to get into a little bit about what basic services are, typically it's your MEP, structural, civil, food service, spec writers, cost estimator, code consultants, things that you really need to put a good set together. We typically look at non-basic service or additional conditions as unknowns. So if you can imagine starting a job and they want to survey their property, and they say, we want you to give us a fee for the survey. Well, you might only be working on 10 acres, but they might have a 2,000 acre property. You know, do you put a fee together that includes a 2,000 acre survey, or do you put a fee together as a 10-acre survey? So that's kind of an unknown, is something that you would want to, after the fact, identify with the client and do an additional service. So it's really specific to the project. Geotechnical is another one that we often find as a ad service. You never know exactly where you're going to put the footprint until you start studying the site a lot. So once you find where you're going to put the footprint, then you might know where and how many, geotechnical piers or drillings and piles that you need to do in order to get the information to design your foundations. This is all exciting stuff, but again, if any questions as you go along, traffic, AV, any kind of specialty designs. I know there's a lot of lighting designers and people in the lighting industry here. If we're dealing with certain projects where they have requirements for very specialty design requirements, we might hire a specialty design lighter, and that could be additional services. That might be a part of base, depending on, again, what you agree to. Theater consultants, athletic fields. Surprisingly, you never know the full scope of the athletic fields they want early on in a project, so we want to try to keep some of those away from our basic services. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the disruptors and fees, that I'm seeing. One is technology. As technology is getting more prevalent, clients are having higher expectations. And what I mean by that is, we used to, do a few renderings on a project to help identify what certain spaces would look like. Now we're doing full modeling software and, all the different softwares that can create really lifelike renderings. And clients are starting to expect that more in earlier stages, which is kind of hindering some of our design process, because you want to be able to, provide those more final renderings later, but because clients are wanting those now, you're starting to have to think about that when you're building a fee. What are the expectations you have to lay out to the client as to what kind of visual communications you're going to provide to them. Technology also is allowing us to coordinate better. So clients are having higher expectation of how well coordinated your models are, because everything's being modeled. So taking into account the level of coordinating ahead of time, our engineers used to write on a piece of paper and say, these are schematic. And then you would go into CA and you do the coordination of CA. Now we're modeling everything, and then we're going to CA, and then we're doing the coordination. So it's making for better coordinated buildings, but again, you're setting higher expectations of clients. So you want to make sure that if they have the higher expectations, you're building some of that into your fee to ensure that you have the ability to spend that extra time modeling, the slope of the fire protection or the plumbing rain leaders, because those are things that really tend to have the most conflicts.
I guess I have a question on that.
Yeah, go
How
ahead.
do you get, because if you're trying to set their expectations and you want to probably get this in writing, right, with them, how do you describe that? With how well coordinated they expect things to be, or you're planning on having things be,
Yeah.
It seems like it would be a hard thing to
I guess
get specific about. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I mean by understanding the level of coordination, it's more of making sure the contracts you have with your sub-consultants indicate the level of modeling they're going to do and are required to do.
I see. Okay.
So that they identify in their fee that they're going to be modeling and sloping everything. So when you do, or underground, you're going to ask the engineers now, the structural engineers, to model the foundations and step the foundations where they step, so that when the underground plumbing is going through it, it's all in the right location. So we kind of set expectations with our consultants as to the level of coordination, and then you could write that in your fee letter to just say, we're providing this level of BIM coordination. I guess I was just saying, so yeah, so that's part of my point, was just that now clients are expecting that. So if you don't make your consultants do that, you can get hit with an additional service from your own sub-consultant, which it's hard to go back to the owner and say, in order for us to coordinate your building better, we need to pay our other sub a little more money. Can we get additional money for that? So addressing that up front is part of what I've seen it to be an issue and things we deal with.
Bobby, are you clarifying that both with the client and the consultant, up front to make sure that everyone's on the same page for exactly what's going to be done?
Correct. And usually, and at this point, the client, it's assumed now. So it's more of us making sure our consultants meet our expectations.
Yeah.
So that we know when we're in CA, we're not having things that aren't coordinated to the level we wanted them to be coordinated to. Another one is energy codes. This is a really kind of a game changer right now, because this is the first time that energy codes seem to be ahead of the building codes. And it's causing a lot of confusion, especially with schools right now, because when the energy code was written, schools were somewhat not thought about as a building type. So it's put us in this interesting area where we almost have to meet passive house in order to meet the energy code for some of the stretch communities. And so we're struggling right now to really understand how that impacts the school, and whether or not we're going to have to bring on specialty code consultants or energy consultants now to help us with some early modeling. For anyone that's worked on MSBA projects, the feasibility schematic design fee is set by the town, not the MSBA, and it typically is significantly lower than what you actually need to do that project. So when you start to add further complications of energy code and more expectations of having decisions made early on, you have to try to push back and negotiate those fees and really think about those kind of things. And the last thing I'll talk about before anyone wants to give questions or Brian jumps in on his end. It's the construction delivery method, where you're going with a construction manager or a 149 hard bid, which is a general contractor. When you work with construction managers, you're typically asked to do early design packages. So you're at 60% CDs and you're asked to release the steel or foundation drawings, which means, you're expected to essentially be 100% done at 60% with the steel and foundation, which is never the case. So you always have to make sure there's contingencies built in. But the struggle is you're actually starting CA while you're in design. So building a fee that understands that you might need to bring a person in to manage the CA portion while you're still finishing the design. And then do you need someone else to help with your quality control to help coordinate? Because anytime you make a change, you then have to follow back through the CA process. So there's levels of added costs that I think architects sometimes overlook or are assumed to just have to build into their fee when they're working with a CM. And CMs tend to sometimes push owners to do more early packages than maybe are needed, or as a way to kind of maybe show their value, which I think there's a lot of value in CMs in different projects, but we definitely have found that there's a struggle there, and we eat a lot of money, coordinating with CMs early on that we don't always account for. So that might have been pretty quick, but I think I captured kind of holistically what I was trying to say today. So, but happy to have conversations about it.
Can I ask you a quick question before we move over to
Sure.
Brian? When you're looking at these early bid packages, what is the rationale typically from the CM?
So typically it's to reduce the construction schedule. So you're the whole goal is to finish construction as quick as possible so that you have less escalation, you have less unknown in the future. So by allowing them to do early bid packages, they're essentially, by the time you're done with your drawings, they're already in the ground and working, as opposed to with a Chapter 149 project, you finish your job and then they have to mobilize, put the fence in, start, put all the shop drawings in. Once you get those back, then they can start digging for foundations. So you save about 3 or 4 months on a construction schedule a lot of times by starting early with a CM.
A question, you mentioned that the fees for the studies that you do for the MSBA are usually like preset, right? Like they give you the fee. You don't really, they don't say, what's your fee for this work? They say, this is what we want you to do, and here's what we'll pay you to do it, right?
Yes.
And similar with like DCAM work, I've been doing a lot of DCAM work. And I'm sure other public entities as well, right? And like you mentioned, usually not aligned with the effort required to do it, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, I feel like this is a broader profession issue, right? But I don't know, I'm curious if you've had any luck or have any insight on negotiating that, or I don't know, finding ways to improve that situation.
It is a challenge, and the reason it's becoming, it's kind of feels like it's compounded over time, is that the towns hire the OPMs and they create budgets early on, and they say this is for feasibility schematic, and because they typically have to go to a vote schematic, towns want to, you know, expand as limited as resources as possible to limit their own risk. So it puts a lot of risk on the designer and the architect to, you know, hope that the town vote is going to pass. And then the MSBA kicks in the funding. And once the funding's there, everyone is more secure at the funds. And the MSBA has their kind of standard 10% reimbursement allowance. And usually you can build a fee within that 10%. That helps you make up a lot of the potential losses you had in feasibility schematic. But again, it is a risk. So sometimes, going back to your question a little bit more specifically, some projects, you know, we've been able to, once we've got in there, the owner will allow us, they'll either go back to the town for more if they really need it, or once you get going, they know that they realize that the scope needs to get larger so that they will provide more. Sometimes we're running with skeleton crews early on to really kind of just meet the minimum requirements that we need to get to through schematic design. So it really is a challenge, but I don't think there's been very many. And when I say it's a fixed fee, it's just really each town is kind of looking at the past project or neighboring towns. And if they were low and they were able to do it, their community's like, why can't we do it for that?
Well,
You know,
right. Well, yeah. And
nobody
this is where it
really,
becomes like a profession-wide thing where
yeah, and that's why
admittedly
it
we
kind
all
of
keep doing it, right?
correct. And we
We're
keep,
self-perpetuating our own
that's the
problem.
problem, is we are, and it's because the risk is mitigated once you get past SD, because, you know, once the funding's there with MSBA, that's the best part, is that they see it through the end. You don't have to worry about a project not going forward after SD if it passes its vote. So, but it is definitely a significant challenge.
Thanks.
But yeah.
All right, maybe Brian, we'll turn it over to you to, I'll say the question again, because I know it's been a little while since we kicked off here. So could you tell us a little bit about the type of work that you do and the process you go through for determining your fee for your work?
Sure. So I'm Brian Fontaine with Turva Design Solutions. Thank you all for having me here. Most of the work I do is in the private sector, so very little public work as compared to Bobby. So we go about the process a little bit differently, where we don't have as many constraints that might come along with the public work in terms of putting together the fees and services and things like that. Most of the projects I work on are in healthcare and in higher education. So in some cases for higher education, some of our bigger college clients will have some stipulations set in place when it comes to developing the project fees. For example, some, you know, depending on who you're working with, oftentimes when you're putting your fee together, there's some that require a little bit more transparency than others, where in some cases you can just provide kind of like a lump fee for each section of, or for each phase of a project, whereas some have you fill out an entire spreadsheet detailing exactly how many hours this person's doing at what rate. So there's some that do require that detail information, whereas others don't require as much. I'd say when we're looking at putting together an appropriate fee, our first place to look is benchmarking with previous projects. So what did we put together for a fee for this last project? How did we perform? Did we make money? Did we lose money? Are there areas where we didn't account for enough fee? Where can we make improvements? Things like that. And additionally, looking at oftentimes our clients will already have a construction budget in mind, so we can benchmark what do we think the fee for this project should be? How does that relate to the anticipated construction cost, which can range between, for architecture and engineering fees to, 7 to 12%, depending on what project type it is, that sort of thing. So we want to make sure we're within those ranges and not way above or way below, since that's a benchmark that we use quite a bit. As I said, project size and complexity has a big determinant in our fees. Also, a lot of the projects I work on are in old existing buildings, which come with a whole nother level of exposure in and of itself. Oftentimes, even our clients that have pretty well put together like planning, design, and construction internally do not always have very good existing building information. Sometimes I'm looking at, scan drawings from the 70s that I can't even read what's on them, yet I'm expected to be able to determine the existing conditions from them, or like old piping or ductwork. Is that really how it is today or how it was actually built? I don't know. So
I just have to say,
think,
10 out of 10 agree with you there.
so I think whenever possible, and this also kind of comes in play with working with the client and putting the proposal and fee together, but making sure that with existing buildings where there's limited information, to make sure that we can incorporate investigative work where possible. Like, for example, there's no electrical information on this building and we have a panel that was original in 1955. Let's make sure we're accounting in the schedule to have an electrician come out to trace the panel and get all the information we need to be able to make sure, do we need to upgrade this panel? Probably if it's original from 1955, but if the client's trying to save money, you're always trying to work back and forth with them, right? So so those are definitely the key things for existing buildings, in my opinion, that I've seen. I'd say when it comes to putting the fee together and making sure everyone's on the same page, I know it sounds a little silly with alliterations, but I call it the 3 S's: being clear on scope, services, and schedule. Make sure everybody's on the same page with all of those things, so that when things do happen, because they always do, the scope is going to creep in a certain direction, or we need to take on additional consultants that weren't anticipated, or we're not getting the answers we need in time and the schedule's starting to slip. Like, being extremely clear with your clients on those sort of things allow for those additional service conversations to happen a little bit easier. Like, we all knew this, we're all on the same page, so let's work together on this, because we want to make sure everyone gets what they need and that the project is completed to the satisfaction of the client. And sometimes that means having to bring on additional fees so that we're not losing our shirts, right? But also, we also want to work with our clients as well to make sure that they're getting what they need as well. So
I'm gonna chime in. So you bring up you bring up a topic that has been hot in our office lately, is schedule and how that ties to fee. And I feel like there's a bit of I think what I'm kind of like realize, it's like there's this sweet spot on schedule, right? Like, this is the time you want to do it. If you want it faster, it takes more. If it stretches out way longer, it also takes more, right? Like, it's like Goldilocks and Three Bears a little bit, right? And I think sometimes it's hard. I've been finding it sometimes hard to demonstrate that to clients and like really quantify it, or so I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, but
yeah, I think it just kind of needs to be, it is hard. Like, I've recently had some conversations with clients on a project that it's going 2 months over construction, and I haven't done any less hours than I had anticipated. Like, we still have our weekly construction meetings, we still have our weekly walkthroughs and field reports that we have to do. It's not like that's just going to stop once I'm hit my limit in the schedule. Like, that stuff all still needs to happen for me to be able to issue affidavits at the end of the day, right? So it's I think it's also, in my experience, especially with repeat clients, like building a good level of trust and understanding with each other, and like making sure to have conversations about these kind of things early on. So that way, when we do get to that point, it's not a shock, right? Like, oh, I can't believe like you're telling me this now. Like, no one wants to hear bad news, but being able to have conversations earlier on when you start to see something slip, like, by the way, like it looks like from what I see, the schedule is starting to slip, and we may require some additional services if we're going to have to extend our time on the project. So long story short, being upfront with the clients, I think, is the best way to kind of deal with that when you first start seeing an inkling of something maybe extending or going wrong.
No, Brian, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was
just
gonna
had a
say, I
quick
think you had something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I had a
Edward.
quick question. First, it's great hearing architects discuss this because this is something that we normally don't get a chance to see. So I just had a quick question about renovations and existing
Sure.
buildings, and what type of fee increase do you anticipate between that and new construction? Because there's so many unknowns.
I don't know that I could speak to like a percentage or like a number, but because honestly, full transparency, I don't really do any new construction, so I'm strictly like my focus is on the existing. So I can't really compare apples to apples with that. I don't know if Bobby, if you have any insight on that.
We do, most of our fees are lump sum, but we will look at a renovation. You might, with a renovation job, the first thing you have to do is existing conditions. And I think Brian alluded to how difficult it is for existing drawings to be considered existing conditions. So we will negotiate a fee that now, the great news is you can get buildings scanned for fairly cheap, considering the size of them. It's like 10 to 15 cents a square foot or something to get a building scanned in a point cloud. And then you work with them and decide, do you want to, I was just actually having this conversation with someone right before this meeting, what level you want them to model that point cloud into your Revit. So you might start off with a very solid existing condition model where you can now, the extra time is just really going through the building and documenting any kind of discrepancies and making sure that as you're moving walls, you're checking things against the existing structural drawings and things that you have access to. But I don't know if there's a percentage that you could put on it, but if I did, I would say the amount of extra time for a renovation versus for a building might be 10 to 15% more hours of labor, just because of that job site investigation that really needs to happen to get things to where you
schedule.
Yeah.
Bobby, would you say that would translate through all phases of the project or just at the beginning?
It definitely, actually the beginning is, I would say it's less, I guess it has a little bit of creep in each phase. Mainly the construction documents is where I find it to be the most significant, because that's when your design is set and now you're going through all your detailing and you have to, you start to open this wall or close that wall and you're getting into the fine detail and you're going, wait a minute, the brick coursing here is an interior wall and it's brick, and how do I close this off? And and then you have to maybe do some exploratory demo in order to understand the actual thickness or what's made up of that wall. We just did a renovation job at Bristol County Agricultural High School. It was six buildings, and one was like 4 renew and 2 renovations. And those are the kind of things we were struggling with, was when we were in construction documents going, oh no, we got to actually detail this now. We got to detail this different. We can't use our standard detail that we've used on every other project. And, redrawing those details just wasted a lot of time.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that I've also found that when there's less, there are a lot of unknowns, that when you start uncovering things in construction, it's like, well, that detail that I spent all that time on during construction was a complete waste of time, and now I have to redo it during CA.
Absolutely. It's
so
really
it's interesting how it really does translate in some ways to all phases.
Yeah. And Brian, I realized when I was talking about my stuff, I was talking more general about all the things that go into a fee, but we do benchmark our fees as well. And we do what's called a top down, bottom up approach. So top down, you put in your construction cost, you put in your overhead factor, and then you go through each phase of the project and you say, how many people, what duration, how many hours, and you start building it up. And then you plug in either what you think the consultant's numbers are going to be, or you could use kind of a benchmark is 40% of the fee will be theirs. So we have a spreadsheet I created that allows us to kind of work through that without having consultant fees in there. And then you get to the bottom and you see what your DLBM is, which is the direct labor multiplier. And that's what you multiply things by in order to see what kind of profit you're going to have. And then you do the bottom up approach, which you just say, I want to make this much money, which you put in your DLBM multiplier and the construction cost, and it tells you what your fee should be. So you're looking at two fees, and one is what you think you need, and one is what you think you're going to get. And then you reconcile the two. And a lot of that is that benchmarking, going back and saying, okay, I'm carrying 35,000 hours for this whole project right now. And a similar school I just did, we did it in 32,000 hours. And working with Tracy, who tracks all this, we track all our actual hours. We'll say, we actually spent this. So we know that 2 or 3 schools were around 32. Then I know I can cut probably about 3,000 hours off my fee to help bring it down. And then, or you go back and start negotiating with your consultants again and saying, hey, do you guys think you can cut a little off because we can't quite make the fee work here. So that's what
a good plug for our February session where we'll talk more about
we'll
negotiating with the consultants, because
talk about
that's
that
a whole nother
but
topic for sure. Especially, at least I found in the situations where you are given a specific fee and that's not negotiable. Your only negotiation is really with your consultants.
That's
Can I ask a question real quick about the top down, bottom up?
sure.
My experience of that is that we always put the top down number in based on a percentage that we think the client wants to see, or what we think will be competitive. And then we do the bottom up and we realize that we are like a lot over, like 4% over, like a third over or something. And then we go back and convince ourselves through a little bit through benchmarking, but a little bit through just, I think, optimism that we will be able to do it for, whatever. I also feel that we never, so I'm wondering if that's a shared experience is my first question. And my second one is because architects often price pegged to a construction budget, but then at least the experience of the last few years since COVID is that construction budgets often escalate. I don't work on like state projects, so I know that might be a very different world, but I'm just curious about if anybody has a mechanism for going back to clients when costs have escalated, which is always an unhappy time anyway, because it's often somehow blamed on you. Even if it's COVID and other forces. I'm just wondering to kind of like, are people literally pegging it to the fee, or are they lump sumifying their fees based on percentages? I'm just wondering if anybody's ever successfully negotiated more money when construction costs have escalated.
Yeah, most of ours for the state projects, we are lump sum based on a budget set at schematic design. And we have to hold that budget all the way through to the end, even if construction prices go up. The MSBA says, unless the towns are willing to kick in more money, they're not increasing their grant. So most clients make us find ways to get back to budget, which is very difficult because with the MSBA, you can't even cut scope. You can't cut square footage out of a project. So it's really materials. And I know during COVID, we were able to successfully argue, I think, on a few projects of some additional services, just based on how the nature of how things were, where we were having to redesign that due to things that were outside our control. Everyone was $30 million over, but $20 million over budget for some of these large projects. And it was everybody, it was a shared experience. And because of that, there was a little bit more aptitude by the owner to understand on some of these larger projects, but I we don't like to go back for additional services. So I agree. It's a very difficult conversation to figure out what's the right way to do it. But we peg it to construction costs based on the schematic design estimate, which, and luckily that can't increase typically doesn't increase. So I don't know if others have experience doing that, but oh, Glenn, looks like you have your hand up.
I have a related question. I'm sub-consultant here, not an architect. You talk about fee based on percentage of construction costs, and I gather that's mandated in some public work, but in private work, I mean, how much do architects actually use that anymore in developing their fee? I mean, so it's I was sort of taught like 20 years ago, like, okay, architects' fees are 8% of construction costs, and that's how they set their fee for the whole team. But is that still the case, or is it more like that's just sort of maybe a check on your fee that you develop based on the effort?
I know
Personally,
for
it's a check. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say for me it's usually more of a check. The bulk of looking at the fee for me is more looking at the benchmarking aspect and like knowing my team, how many hours I anticipate things to take for everyone at each phase, and then looking back to make sure I'm not like way over or way under what sort of the industry standard is.
I might be misrepresenting state work. It's not a mandatory fee at a percentage. It's specifically the MSBA has a reimbursement mechanism where they say we'll reimburse up to 10% of construction costs. And they've now capped it at $500 a square foot. So they said, and then the towns have to kick in 100% of the money if they want to pay above that. So most towns will always agree to what the MSBA will reimburse up to because they're paying a percentage on the dollar for that fee. Negotiating higher than that is difficult, so that is a check for us. So that's why we will do the top down, bottom up first to see where we are, and we use that as our benchmark, knowing that most towns will go there, and if we can fit our fee within that, great. If we can't, then we struggle to figure out, do we go for more and see if they'll pay for additional more, dollar for dollar, or do we have to cut our fee back down to be within that realm of the MSBA's? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how we do it.
All right, I'm going to steer the conversation a little bit, make sure we hit the learning objectives here. So one of the things that we want to make sure we talk about is how you work with your internal design team to make sure the project stays on target with the fee and schedule that you've agreed to with the owner, with the client.
Sure. Brian, you want to take that? Do you want me to go?
Do you mean like with our internal team? Do you mean consultants too, or just like our architectural design team?
More the architectural design team, because generally, at least in my perspective, the consultants are kind of like responsible for maintaining their own, right? Like they're only going to invoice what we've agreed to their fee being. So it's kind of their problem if they go, in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it takes a lot of like checking in with staff to make sure that everyone has all the information they need to be able to do the work that they need to do. That's a big part of like staying as efficient as possible, right? I think another important aspect would be just double checking like what we're spending periodically as well. Making sure that people are actually spending the number of hours that you anticipate. If there seems to be a lag in one direction, kind of like having those conversations with your team to understand like what's causing you to take extra time, like that normally doesn't take you this much time, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's technical issues, sometimes it's just personal things going on with our staff too. Like there's a lot of things that play into every aspect, but I think just checking in on our staff and what challenges they're facing, usually project related, that having an open dialogue is what's important to keep things moving forward.
You communicate with them the number of hours you estimated for them, or do you?
Yeah, usually we have a meeting every Monday to kind of figure out like who's working on what and how many hours we anticipate them to work so that we make sure everyone's, at capacity, whether it's doing project work or, overhead sort of initiatives, that sort of stuff. So usually those hours that we put in place tie back to what we have for a project fee and what we anticipated them spending on certain tasks. So we're a smaller firm, so it's a little easier to have those like individual conversations with each person. But project planning is a pretty typical thing at bigger firms too, right? Working in Deltec and like kind of looking at the whole staff, who's billable, who's not, that sort of thing. But usually I know at my old firm when we used to plan out projects, like it was always kind of based on like the even months out for larger projects, like how many hours this person's going to work on the project, and then looking back to make sure that you're not going over the fee. And then over time, checking back to see, all right, this person actually spent this much time or they didn't, like why, going, however deep you need to go to regulate things.
Yeah, we have very similar experience to what Brian is saying, a lot of check-ins. We have monthly billing meetings where we check in project hours and project and dollars spent. So sometimes you might overspend your hours, but your dollars are underspent, or sometimes your hours are overspent, your dollars overspent, your hours are underspent. So you can see, are we bringing on people that are more expensive than we thought we were originally, or do we have people less expensive than we thought originally? So those are very helpful, and we do those with Tracy. She keeps us on task. And then, trying to share that back with the team. We also do one large staffing meeting each month, and that helps us understand other project needs. And we talk about, we're behind here, so we need to bring in more staff, and then we have to do budget adjustments or see how that works with our budget. So it's
Great.
basically all the same things.
Yeah, I think we do very similar things at SLAM too. This all sounds familiar. And then another thing we wanted to hit on was how you go about preparing documents to share with the client regarding fees. And Brian, you kind of touched on a little bit how transparent you are on the breakdown of like how many hours and individuals and that, and just what you guys have generally provide to clients as far as that. I know Brian, you kind of touched on it, so maybe Bobby.
Yeah.
Sure.
Or
Go ahead, Bobby.
Does either way. When we put our fee letter together, typically we're just breaking it out by phase if it's a lump sum, and we'll do the total schematic, this, and based on the scope of services we will tweak, but we typically follow pretty typical. I think it's like 10 or 15 for schematic, and then 15 for design development, and then it builds from there, and then usually save about 25 for construction documents by the end of it. So trying to think on, we have had projects, I think Rhode Island was one that in Rhode Island, they actually required a breakdown that showed the hours and anticipated things to help build up your fee. So those get a little bit challenging sometimes because, we are being very hypothetical on some levels with the way we're building our fees up of what we think. So we don't want to get caught in a situation where they say, wait a minute, you said this and that, and this isn't what I'm seeing. So but I know, Tracy, you might be able to talk a little bit about this. When you put together our actual bills to the clients, a lot of times you break down the hours that were spent. And I believe you send that to them as a way. Is that correct? Some of the
we did that with time and materials. So we have, I'm sure you may know, we have a few different ways that we invoice, whether it's lump sum or not to exceed, time and materials. There are some things, and this can happen with additional services as well, where the client wants to see the time and material. That is an example of when we would send, not back up, but just the hours that were worked on the project or the scope of work.
Yeah, and I think you were talking about, getting so specific with like a certain person or level of person doing a certain task for certain hours, at seeing that breakdown from the beginning. And that can be especially challenging in a smaller firm where, let's say, there's a task that needs to get done, and we accounted for one person at this billing rate to do those tasks, but they're not available, or you know, they're working on something else. So someone else at a higher billing rate has to come in and do that same work. In theory, should take maybe less time to do, maybe not. But it's still at that higher rate that, you know, it's a little hard to it can be hard to meet those fees that you've set out if you have other people at higher rates doing things that you anticipated someone at a lower rate doing. And that's
Yeah.
also hard to try to, you can't really go back to them and be like, well, this more expensive person had to do this task, so we need to ask for more money, sort of thing. I mean, that's not a huge thing, but just something that could happen sometimes.
I see your hand up. Do you want to chime in?
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating. Thank you, Bobby and Brian, for your comments. I'm curious, this is a selfish lighting question for the lighting designers on the call, but you mentioned that there's certain triggers where you might need to bring in a specialty lighting consultant. I'm just curious in your experiences about what percentage of your projects do you find that you're bringing in somebody like that? And then I think, Bobby, you also mentioned maybe 40% of a fee might be held for subs. Does that consider a lighting consultant in it? And if it does, do you have a number that you usually hold for us to keep in mind as we're building fees?
No, I don't have a number. The first question, the percentage of projects. We do a lot of our work with our engineers, and we have local experts within our firm within lighting, and Alexander's one that helps us do a lot of our internal lighting and is a liaison to kind of the outside world to kind of meet some of our needs. But we will have it on specialty spaces, definitely, like sometimes theater design. I think our JQS project brought in a lighting designer for that. So trying to think if there's a better way to answer the question, but I don't really have a percentage of times. It's every project typically has some kind of specialty lighting. The question is, do we feel that we have enough expertise to do it, or what are the client's expectations of that space that we really want to really get into it? Regarding the fee, the 40% is for the overall consultants, and if we feel that that specialty lighting should be, yes, it would be in that pot of money. And again, that's kind of just a baseline for when we do our top-down fee. So I would have to go back to past projects and say, this is who we use on this project. This was their fee. We try to solicit maybe 1 or 2 fees, depending on our relationship with different consultants before we choose. So we could talk more later. I could look back and try to help you out if you had more questions on that, but
No, it's super helpful. It's helpful to hear that everyone wrestles with this ambiguity of like the top down, bottom up, and then it doesn't match. And then, I think as lighting designers, we're hoping that architects are going to fight the fight, but it's a hard fight to fight, so we all have to prove our value. So it's just interesting to know what people are kind of bookmarking for those numbers. I worked in a large firm, and they basically said, try to be at 1%, try to be 1% of the thing, because then we'll be able to bring that piece in. So I wondered if you're holding rules with them like that too. So Brian, is it similar for where you're sitting as well?
Yeah, it's definitely like a case by case basis. And typically when we need a specialty space to be looked at, I personally haven't done a lot of projects where we've that have that many sort of specialty spaces. So I haven't typically worked with lighting designers too often, but oftentimes I feel like usually knowing what the client needs and what they want, we typically know, like, as part of our initial proposal and fee, if that's a desire and a need, rather than like bringing on someone later, is what I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And why I like to go for additional services or have that not in my basic services is because typically the owner, if you're not negotiating your basic service, it's easier to get the additional service approved when they say, oh yeah, we want a special lighting designer. They know there's a need. You say, here's a couple prices we got. This is what they are. And then you choose from there. So it's easier to get your fee that you need if you do that way. If we're trying to cram you into the general 40%, that's when it gets tougher.
Thanks.
I have a kind of similar follow-up question. not necessarily lighting related, but having to do with when do you solicit consultants who are MBE, BBE, or WBE?
Sure.
And is that required by the state? If it's not required by the state, do you still go after those consultants?
We do. We try to build. We have a lot of history with various consultants that we use on all projects, but there are state requirements that we're always trying to adhere or exceed. So with MSBA jobs, you have to put your team together at the proposal phase. So you go in with that team, and if that team gets selected, that's the team you're using. After the fact, where we're looking through all of our consultants. So we're always trying to build relationships with as many consultants as we can, so we can always have the best on the projects that we work with. So.
Yeah, and Turva is an MBE, so we love working with other MBEs and WBEs on our projects. And I mean, generally we try to figure out who's going to be the best fit depending on what the project is, but I wouldn't say there's a specific method for seeking specific people out. It's just kind of like who's going to be the best fit, knowing what our skill set is and what our consultant skill sets are too.
So it's about relationships.
Exactly.
Okay. Great, thanks.
I've got kind of I know we have like about 5 minutes left here, so I have a question, kind of a personal experience scenario question, how you guys have approached similar things. So if you submitted a fee and the client has come back and said, that really is higher than we wanted, or higher than we were expecting, but you feel pretty firmly that that's appropriate for the work, what's your, how do you go about rationalizing it? I guess, like, where do you start? Do you get into the details of like, well, this is how many hours we think, and this is who's going to work out? Like, do you find that is helpful, or is it more about like talking about, I don't know, the complexity of the project and how that played into how you considered your fee? Or, I'm just curious how you go about that.
I just had an experience with this right now. I'm actually working through it on a current project, and it's been very difficult. But we've tried a lot of methods. We've did full disclosure. We said, look, this is how we build a fee, and we took them through it. And we said, we didn't get all the nitty gritty, but we were saying that we bring it, we do this, we do that, we go up, and we figure it out here. We have a profit margin that we try to hit, and we're like this. When we go to here, this is our break-even fee. So if you want it for this price, you have to know that we're not making any money. And basically, we don't like to work like that, because at that point, we have to cut services. Like you're not going to see both principals or one of the principals, or you're going to start to see reduced staff, and we're going to have to do it lean and mean. We told them we had to cut 3 months out of the design schedule in order to compact it and make it a much quicker project. And we told them they have to expect a lot of additional services, because we're going to write in our letter all the things that we aren't going to do, and we're going to need additional services for it. And it's a tough conversation, but you ultimately kind of, hopefully they see the value in not wanting you to come back every 2 minutes for additional services. But it's a very tough conversation, and that's we just kind of keep finding other ways to prove our worth in that sense.
Yeah. Brian, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts before you wrap.
I think dovetailing off of Bobby, I think when you are getting that kind of pushback, it's important to be as transparent as possible as to how you got to where you did, and being able to clearly outline what you accounted for. And sometimes that'll spark from the client side, I don't need you to include that, so you can exclude that to reduce the fee. Okay. But again, like Bobby said, making sure in the proposal that you all exclude it, so that later on when it does come up, you're like, hey, by the way, remember we excluded this? Yeah. And sometimes it's, we don't always know what their construction budget is when we're putting a fee together, and we make assumptions based on what we see at a walkthrough or a conversation. And then it turns out, oh, actually, this is what our construction budget is. And, it's a lot, we're paring back the scope knowing that, you know, this X, Y, or Z has occurred. So it's, again, it all comes, someone, I think it was Ed said, it's all about relationships, and that goes between not only our consultants, but especially with our clients too. So able to have good relationships with especially repeat clients to have that transparency and have good conversations and understanding with each other, I think is the key to everything when it comes to fees.
Definitely.
I think that's a great note to end on, unless anyone has any follow-up questions here. All right. Well,
Great.
thanks everyone. It's some good
Yeah.
participation
Thanks for having
today.
us.
Yeah. Thanks
you.
to Brian and Bobby for joining us. And I hope people join us in
We'll see
February
you
for
next
the
month.
oh yeah, for the discussion
Yeah.
about
Thank you so
consultancy.
much for having us. This was
Absolutely.
great.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Very helpful.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.